Hey, how's it going, guys? My name is Dom, and today I'll be showing you how to create this word counter right here using HTML, CSS, and of course JavaScript. Okay, so this project is going to be beginner friendly because it's going to be relatively straightforward to do, and it's also going to give you a nice sense of achievement once you're done. And you can also even expand upon it and make it more advanced. All right, so first I want to show you how it works before jumping into the actual code. So right here, I've got an old video description copied on my clipboard. So I'm going to be pasting it inside here. And as we can see, upon pasting in the text on the bottom here, we have a couple of different counts. So we can see here, I've got 42 words inside this body of text, as well as 188 letters and 39 spaces. Okay, so the way this works is basically, we're going to be taking this body of text right here, and then we're going to be splitting it up by spaces. So basically, we're going to get these groups of characters, okay, which may or may not be a word. And for every single one of these groups of characters, we're going to be running a couple of tests on them. And basically, if they pass all the tests, then they're going to be considered to be a word, and it's going to be adding 1 to this word count. So that's how it's going to work. Now, let's jump into this tab right here and begin from scratch to create what I just showed you. And also keep in mind that the source code for this is going to be linked down below if you want to download it and follow along. So, hopping inside the text editor, I've got this index HTML with nothing inside the body. So basically, we're starting fresh. Now, the first step is going to be to create a new directory here for CSS, as well as one for JS or JavaScript. And then we can create a new main.css inside the CSS directory and do the same thing for the JavaScript one, a main.js. Okay, perfect. So now we can link up these two files in the index.html by going inside the head here, and we can drop down below the title. We can just say a link towards a CSS file going to CSS, then / main.css. And then for the JavaScript, we'll just be saying a script source going to JS / main.js. And then it's very important that we include the defer attribute. This right here, just make sure that the JavaScript code is only going to run once the document is ready to be worked on. It's going to avoid errors like can't access this on element null and things of that nature. Okay, so make sure you include the defer attribute right there, very important. Cool. So now we can begin on the HTML before moving on to the CSS and the JavaScript. So in terms of the HTML for this project, we're going to begin by creating a new div with a class of container. So this container right here is going to be the main container for the entire project. Dropping inside here, we can make a new h2 with a class of title. We can just say something like word counter as the container's title. Dropping down below, we can then create a text area, and we can just remove all of the default attributes on here and just keep the class of text-input just like that. Okay, cool. So now we can also include a placeholder text here, and that's just going to say something like, paste text here, just something to prompt the user to, of course, paste their text. Okay. We can now drop down and create a new div. So we're going to be creating multiple of these divs here, in fact 3, one for every single line of results. So first up, we've got the word count. We can make a new strong here, and we can just say something like word count with a space. We can then drop down and make a new span here with a class of word-count, and then we can just default this to be 0. Perfect, right? We can now create 2 more of these, one for the letter count. Make this also letter count inside the class, and of course the number of spaces. Okay, we can just say space count just like that. Also defaulting to 0 for both of those. So now, if I save this and go back inside the browser, we can see we get something like this. So now let's apply some CSS to make this look like this. Okay, so going inside the main.css file, we're going to begin by targeting the body right here. So we're going to remove the default margin in the HTML in the browser, okay? So we can say a margin of 0, just like that. We can also target the class of container, and as well as everything inside the container, including the text areas and any buttons if you wish to have any buttons, okay? We can make this a font family of sans serif just to change the default font. Now the reason for including an asterisk here to target every element inside the container is because of, like I said, the buttons and the actual text area itself, those won't be affected unless I include the asterisk right there. We can now target the class of container itself, and for the container, we can apply here a width of 400 pixels, okay? As well as a margin of 25px and a padding of 25px. So the reason for, the margin and padding here is just to create some white space, make it look nice. So if I save this and go back in the browser, I'm going to get something like this. Okay, so moving on, we can now just apply a border here of 1 pixel and then solid. Okay, and then triple C, just like that, for a light gray, as well as a border dash radius here of 5 pixels. Okay. We can also just lastly apply a line height of 1.4 just to create some space between each one of our lines on the bottom. Go back in the browser and we get something like this. Okay, so now we can hop back inside here. We can target the class of text-input. So for the text area itself, we're going to be applying a width of 100%. This will ensure that the text area will take up the entire width it has available to it, just like that. Okay. We can also drop it down here. We can create, or we can specify a height of 225 pixels, as well as a margin bottom here of 25px. So I want to try and keep this value here for all the spacing consistent across the board. So I've used 25 up here, and then of course down here. We can also apply a resize of none to make sure the user cannot resize the text area by themselves, as well as just dropping down here, we can make a padding of 10px. And if I save this, actually go back in the browser, we're going to get, as we can see here, we're getting a bit of overflow on the text area. So it's taking up more space than it should be, and there's a very small amount of padding between the text area and the container's bounds. So to prevent this from happening, we can include here a box sizing of border box. This will ensure that essentially the padding right here will be included inside the text input width. Okay. Back inside here, and we can see it's looking not too bad. So there's one more thing to style. That's going to be the title. I actually forgot about this earlier, so let's scroll back up and just go between the container and the text input, and we'll target the class of title and give this a margin top of 0, and lastly a margin bottom of 25px, once again maintaining that same gap across the board. Back in the browser, and we get this right here. So now we are done with the CSS. We can now move on to, of course, the JavaScript. Okay, so when it comes to the JavaScript, the first step is going to be to head inside the main.js file, and we're going to be defining the functions which test whether or not a group of characters is considered to be a word. Okay, so inside here, we can define two functions. The first function here is going to be called at least 2 characters. Okay, this right here is going to take through some text, and like I've just mentioned earlier, this text here is going to just be a group of characters which may or may not be a word. The point of this function here is to contribute to the testing of, if this text is actually a word. So we can make a second function here. So the actual second test is going to check if there is an absence of 3 consecutive characters. Okay, so I've done a bit of research and it appears that there's a good chance that if a word has more than or 3 or more consecutive characters of the same character, then that is not going to be a word. So you can add plenty of these functions here once we're done to increase how advanced this solution is. But just for the sake of simplicity and this video, I'm going to have 2 functions here. So how do we then implement these functions? Well, essentially, they're going to return true or false. If they return true, then the test passed. It's one step closer to being a word. If they return false, if even one of these return false, then it's not going to be a word and we scrap it. Okay? So, heading inside the at least 2 characters function, let's define a new constant called letters. So this here is going to use regular expressions to grab every single letter inside this text. So we're going to say text.match. Then inside the match method on the string, going to be defining or passing through a regular expression. So we'll say / then we'll use square brackets here and we'll say A to Z. Okay, then once again a / and we can say IG. So this here is just saying, look, do a global search. So test all the characters inside this text and also make it case insensitive. So maybe do a GI just to keep the global first. It's probably more important. So we'll say GI here, same thing though. Then essentially we have an array of our letters. So if I now console.log the results of letters here, go back in the browser and I call the function at least 2 characters inside the developer console here, F12, we can see if I pass in something like, let's just do, counter as an example, press enter, we get an array of 7 characters here, each letter inside the word counter. Also keep in mind that if I pass through an apostrophe, then an S to say counters, press enter, we only get the S, we do not get the apostrophe. So that is what the A to Z is checking there in the regular expression. So now, got this array, let's get the length of this array and basically just return that. So we can then say return letters.length is more than or equal to 2. So if of course the length is more than or equal to 2, this is going to return true from this function. If not, it'll return false. So that's how that's going to work. Now there's one catch with this design or solution. That is that this match here could return null. So if the text doesn't contain any characters or any letters, this here is going to be null. Now you can't say null.length. That's not going to work. You'll get an error. So if this right here gives us null, we'll say or, then we can say empty array. So basically, if it returns null, it'll then say, okay, cool, no worries. Let's make it an empty array instead. And you're going to get empty array length going to be 0 and you get false. So that is that first function defined. The second function is going to check, of course, the absence of 3 consecutive characters. So for this one, we can basically just loop through all of the characters inside the text. So we'll say here for const character of text, and then we can make a new constant here called occurrences. So we're going to be checking for the number of occurrences of the particular character which you're looping over. Okay, so here we'll say array.from, then we can pass through here the text. So by default, this text here is going to be a string. Okay, so a string does not have the ability to apply a filter on it. Okay, so this will make more sense once I continue the rest of this line here. But basically, the array or arrays have the ability to say, okay, I got the array. In this case here, it's going to be an array of every single character inside this text. Okay, so we've got the array of characters inside the text here. In fact, you know what I will do? I'll just console.log the occurrences constant here, and we can see that we get in the browser if I call absence of 3 consecutive characters pass through something like my name, Dom, we get essentially, as I just sort of mentioned, we get an array of every single character inside the text. Okay, so we've got the array. We can now call the filter method on the array and we'll check. So we'll say v, and we can say v equals character. So essentially the filter here is going to then loop through every single character inside the text. So DOM for my name. It'll check if the D, okay, is equal to the current character. If it is, then it's going to be part of this sort of result set. Then we can return, or we can test, or we can sort of say, get the length property on that. So basically, to put it simply, we're just checking here, look, we've got the current character. So for example, we have D. We're testing the D here, okay? We're then saying, look, let's see how many occurrences of D there is inside the main text. We can now say, essentially, if the occurrences of the current letter is more than or equal to 3, then we can just simply return false. It's going to fail the test, okay? Now, if everything goes well and there is no, consecutive 3 characters of any of the letters here, we can return true. Because of course, by returning false up here, it's going to exit out of the entire function and loop and give us false. If it passes, it's going to return true, and that's that. So we have both of our functions here defined, which check, or contribute to checking if a piece of text is going to be a word or not. So now we've done the majority of the work. We can now drop down, minimize these 2 functions here, and we can now define a couple more constants for a few things. So the first here is going to be a constant called checks, and this here is going to be an array of both of our functions. So we can then pass through here at least 2 characters and absence of 3 consecutive characters. So as we can see, I'm not calling these functions with the parentheses like this. I'm just referencing them inside the array because down below, once we're doing our checks and looping through all of the text in the text area, we've got to say, okay, look, let's loop through both of these functions here and check if it's true or false. So we'll get to this part later on, but for now, let's define those 2 checks right there. And a second constant here called text input equal to document.querySelector, just simply grabbing the element with the class of text-input, of course being our text area, and make a few more query selector calls to the word count element, and give this a class of course, word-count, just like that. And we can also make one for the letter count element, of course, going to letter-count. And lastly, of course, the space count element, going to space-count. So now, of course, we can reference and hook onto our HTML elements inside the JavaScript code. Dropping down even further, we can now do the main chunk of essentially hooking everything together. So we can say text input dot add event listener. We'll add the event listener for input. So we're going to be checking here whenever the user inputs a value inside the text area. When they do input a value, we're going to run this function inside here. So this function here is going to firstly just split up all of the, groups of text inside the body of text. So we'll say const splitted is equal to, and then we can say text input dot value. We'll then say dot trim here to remove white space on the left and right side of the string. Then we'll say split on a couple of characters. So we're going to use regular expressions once again. So /. Then we'll say we're going to be splitting the string on white space. So \s, and also a dash in the case of words which have dashes inside of them. Okay. Ending the regular expression, and also providing just a, well, that's it actually, my mistake. So we're just splitting on those characters right there. So now, if I was to console.log the splitted constant, go back in the browser, let's just test this thing out. So I'll say something like, let's do something like, hey, how's it going? As we can see, every input is going to run this function, and we can see last one here, we get, hey, how's it going? So of course, 4 groups of text or groups of characters inside this main body of text. Okay, so as you probably can already imagine, we're going to be passing each, proposed word inside our functions to, of course, test it. Okay, cool. Also, of course, guys, these extra letter count and number of spaces, they're just like extra, result variables just to, make it a bit more, what do you call it? Interesting, should I say. So anyway, let's stop talking and go back in the code. So we have our splitted array. We can now create a new constant, okay, called letter count. We'll just quickly count the letters inside, the main body. We can just say here, text input dot value dot match. We're going to be looking for here, very similar to the above match in the at least 2 characters. So we can pass through here regular expression. We can just say A to Z and also make this a GI. Then of course, call the dot length on this. So basically look for any characters that's going to be A to Z, case insensitive. But of course, guys, remember this might be null. So let's wrap everything here inside parentheses, then just say or empty array for that null check. And that's going to be our letter count. Very similar situation here for the space count. So to check the spaces, we're going to be saying inside here instead using \s, then of course a plus here to check for essentially if you got multiple spaces in a row, it's going to count as 1 space with that plus right there. Then of course nothing and then empty array. So we could even exclude the I here because of course you can't get case insensitive spaces. So now we've got letter count and space count. Okay, we can now move on to the main part, of course, the word count. So this right here is going to be a let because we're going to be reassigning the value of this variable. So word count is going to be defaulting to be 0. Okay, so now we're going to drop down here and we're going to be looping over every single splitted group of words or group of characters and then running those tests against it. So we can say here for of, and we'll say for const text of the splitted array. So for every single one of those groups of characters, we can drop down, we can now loop through our checks, our functions, right? So we'll say for of, and we can just say here, check of checks. So for every single check function, we can now run that function. So we'll say if not check, then pass in the text here. So basically, if one of these checks returns a false with the not right there, okay, we can now essentially skip this entire splitted text. Now, we're going to be skipping it because if I drop down here, we can increment word count by 1 if we reach this point. So if we loop through every single check for this particular group of characters and it all goes well, then we can increase this by 1, the word count. But of course, inside here, if it goes bad, if one of those functions fails, then we need to skip this entire group of characters. So to achieve that, we'll say continue, okay? Skip to the next iteration. Problem is, this continue is going to be continuing to the next check here. Then of course, if that one passes, or basically it's not going to work because it's always going to reach this point down here. So we need to actually skip this loop and not this loop. So how do we do that? We're going to be using labels. So right up here, we can call this text loop with a colon. So now we're just saying here, look, this outer loop, or we can even use the word outer, might be a bit simpler. So we can say outer here. Okay, so we can now just say continue outer. To continue but on the outer array instead, and skip this text. So now word count is not going to be reached, and it won't be incremented. Okay, cool. So now dropping down here, we can just say word count elements dot text content equal to word count. Okay, and do the exact same thing for the letter count element. So we can just do letter, letter just like this. And of course, lastly, just space. And this right here is, of course, by calling text content, it's going to change the HTML of your word count, letter count, and of course, space count in the HTML, of course, referring to those spans. So if I save this and go back in the browser and I do something like DOM, as we can see, it's going to increment as we go. Hit the name, we get three letters and of course one word. If I press space, we get no increment, or yes, we do actually, my mistake. We of course have one space right there. If I then say something like DOM reads this text, as we can see, it is now working. So that right there is how to create a word counter using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Like I said, guys, you can easily go inside here. You can add some more checks, more functions, make it more advanced. And I actually encourage you guys to do that for learning purposes. But anyway, you can expand upon it. And yeah, so that's it, guys. If you liked today's video, drop a like and subscribe to the channel. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you guys in the next video.